Welcome to Oregon Voters Digest, the program that brings forward the social and political issues that are important to people living here in the Pacific Northwest. And now, your host, Bruce Broussard.
Hello, you're watching another episode of Oregon Voters Digest. I'm Theresa Griffin Kennedy, and I have two guests right now. We were planning on having Phil Stanford, but unfortunately he didn't show up today, so we will schedule him for another episode. I have JD Chandler here today, and I have Bruce Broussard, and I would also like to say to all the mothers out there, Happy Mother's Day. Today is Mother's Day. I would like to wish my mother Doris a Happy Mother's Day, and I'd like to wish Bruce Broussard's mother a Happy Mother's Day, and I would like to wish JD Chandler's mother a Happy Mother's Day, and my two sisters, Marcia and Bronnie, and my late sister Margaret, Happy Mother's Day. So we're going to talk about Rose City Vice, which is Phil Stanford's new book, eventually, but right now Bruce is going to talk to us about the school board. And
Mother's Day.
Mother's Day, okay.
That's why I'm here. That's why Don called me up and said, Bruce, she can't say Mother's Day today. We have to say Happy Mother's Day to you.
Okay.
And Don's going to be on here very shortly, and he's going to say Happy Mother's Day to you.
Okay.
I mean, your husband saying Happy Mother's Day. And he's got another thing. He's got another Father's Day coming up because he just graduated.
Yes.
You know, he's now a professor. He has his tenure in, and said he's going to share that with you guys. But anyway, it is Mother's Day, and I wanted to make sure that I tell my wife, Norma, Happy Mother's Day, and Happy Mother's Day to all the viewers here at the Oregon Voters Digest. We've been traditionally doing this every year, talking to them about Mother's Day, and Happy Mother's Day to you, Theresa.
Thank you.
Okay, we appreciate your efforts and appreciate your being here, but we also appreciate your definition and background on being a mother, because I know hard work.
It is.
Especially one of those young men that I know, Don. What's his name?
Don DuPay.
But he's a good guy.
Yeah.
We run together, so he has to say the same things for me too. But anyway, I think it's very important that we do share that, in fact, because we're living in some very difficult times right now, and we tend not to just take the time to say that, because we got the national campaign, we got the presidential election. It's over with now, and it looks like we're still in the election. We'll probably still be here for the next 4 years, maybe 8 years, if you will. And so, but that's over there in that world. I'm here more interested in the Portland metropolitan area, and like what you're getting ready to do here after I leave aspect of it. But the other thing, I mean, we are right in the midst of an election, a special election for Portland School District, for the board, if you will. And as you know, it's the largest school district in the state of Oregon, and there's still some major problems there. The largest minority population comes out of Portland metropolitan area, and there's a major failure rate here in that school. So it's very important that we get the right folks. And we spent a lot of time through Steve Buell. Steve Buell has been on the show a number of times. In fact, he's the only one that's been accessible to basically giving the public an update on an ongoing basis. Once a month he was on here, and Paul Anthony was another guy that was doing it also too. But he's leaving the school board, and that's going to be quite a loss. And so naturally, I talked to him about this issue, and he said, Bruce, I think I've got the right replacement. And that's through Rita Moore. I've had the opportunity to chat with her about this peace aspect of it. I mean, very open, got a lot of background, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So she's going to be a great mother. Happy Mother's Day, Rita. And I would suggest very strongly that you vote for Rita Moore, okay, on that particular ticket. The other one is Julia Brim Edwards. Julia is, she's been on the board before. She was an employee of, I think she still is, of Nike. She's a big-time exec up in that area. And Nike has been a major community supporter for the schools, and so by on, she's got that skill and that background, and from the corporate community aspect of it, which we need, being that the state budgets are to be having some tough times, and so consequently we want to be looking for that support. That's another one we surely recommend that you vote for. And the other one is Virginia LaForte. She's new to the deal, but she has been very much involved with the school system aspect of it. And very tough woman. In fact, it was said by the person that's running against Rita Moore. Yeah, I want to make sure I pronounce her name right, but Jamia. Anyway, but the bottom line is that she's an African American woman, neat lady aspect of it, but really don't have the skill that Rita aspect of it. But she made a point about the fact that that Steve Buell was a disruptor. And if anything, we need more disruptors, and we got 3 of them right here. So it's a very important piece. We're going to be in some tough time, And so we encourage you to do that. And I might want to do another point out I spoke to Cynthia Harris, who is, she came to Portland, Oregon as an administrator at the Portland Public School. And she went to Jefferson High School. She was principal over there.
She's wonderful. I watched that show.
And she's been on the show many times over. They were doing great things at Portland with that area, but unfortunately they let her go. Politics.
Right.
Politics.
Right.
But she's still here.
Good.
And she's fighting hard, et cetera, et cetera. And so I spoke to her about that, and I think these going to be her selections too. She selected these 3 people too. So we went back and forth about these folks and whatever. And like I said, I got to give the thank you, Steve Buell, for the time that you've been on the school board and the efforts that you've made in the community and trying, if you will, to upgrade the education for all kids. But again, specifically, you did a major focus for African American kids. And I thought that was a very neat piece.
I watched the last time you had him on.
Yes, good people.
He's a great guy.
Yes. So with that, and like I said, that's basically the point I'd like to make at this point in time. Thank you for again allowing us to do this. And this is Mother's Day. Again, happy Mother's Day.
Thank you
very much. I'm going to excuse myself at this point in time. I guess we're going to take a short break, right?
Yes.
Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back, and it's yours.
Okay. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back.
Thank you, Bruce.
Sure enough. Thank you.
You are watching Oregon Voters Digest. This program can be seen again on these channels on these dates and times. Tell a friend.
You're back watching another episode of Oregon Voters Digest. We initially had arranged to have Phil Stanford on, but he wasn't able to make it, so we're going to go ahead and reschedule with Phil. I have JD Chandler here today and my husband Don DuPay, and we're going to talk about writing, and we're going to talk about JD's books, and we're going to talk about Rose City Vice by Phil Stanford. I have some questions that I wrote. And I'm just going to kind of wing it here, JD. You've read the book more than once. I've read it fully one time, and I'm going to need to read it 2 or 3 more times before I really can internalize all of the information in the book. But Phil Stanford talks about the payoffs that were that occurred pretty regularly in the 60s and the 70s at PPB. And what do you think about that? Do you think that they've stopped, that they continue to this day?
Well, I don't know what's going on now with any of this stuff, but in the book, Phil makes the connection between the 1950s vice scandal and the 1970s narcotics scandal, and kind of shows that things really hadn't changed, because the whole outcome of the 1957 vice scandal was, okay, we got rid of the bad guys, we've cleaned everything up, everything's fine in Portland now. But nobody went to jail.
Right.
Nobody was, only one guy was charged with anything. Jim Elkins, the main witness, is the one who ended up seeing legal consequences, and he lost a lot of his power after that. But he was not the one who was calling the shots or, who was behind any of this stuff. The guys who were doing that were power. Terry Shrunk was mayor for the next 20 years.
Right.
So, things didn't really change, and Phil shows really well what the effects of that were on the police bureau in the 70s.
You're right. Nothing did change, because when they came back from Washington, D.C., Jim Purcell Jr., the chief of police, and Terry Shrunk, the mayor, when they came back, nothing really changed. He was still the mayor, although Jim Purcell Jr. lost his job as chief of police. He was placed in a position of power at North Precinct. So So what changed? Nothing. The mayor was still the mayor. The chief of police was still running his prostitution business corruptly behind the desk at North Precinct with his badge. And the vice squad was still doing what they always did. So the three people who ran the city, Purcell, Shrunk, and what's that man's name at workplace?
Crisp.
Chris.
Carl
Between
Crisp.
those-
Carl Crisp.
Between those three guys, they ran the city. And when the new guys come in, like me, the new breed, they shuffled us off to stupid shit. But they still run
Fool's
the city.
errands.
So what happened? Not much new.
So
Not much
I
new,
want to ask
no.
you both this question. In the book, in Rose City Vice, Stanford suggests that Earl's son was murdered, and it sounds pretty compelling, and I'm curious about that because to me that was a really important part of the book. Earl's son was a sheriff detective, and he had announced that he was going to disclose some information about 2 Portland police officers guilty of murder, and then all of a sudden he winds up committing suicide, which Des Connell expressed his belief that it wasn't suicide to, I think, a family member of Earl's son.
Yes.
What are your thoughts, both of you, about Earl's son and his alleged suicide?
Well, Earl's son was a Multnomah County Sheriff's officer from the 50s up until sometime in the 70s. And then he retired, and he went to work for Des Connell as a private investigator.
Okay.
And so in 1979, December 1979, there was the raid on the Outsiders Motorcycle Club up in St. John's.
Right.
And Dave Crowther, a rookie on the narcotics division, was shot to death. So Des Connell was the defense attorney for Robert Pigpen Christopher, who did the shooting. And so Earl's son was trying to make a case for his innocence, that it was self-defense.
Right.
And so it came to a point where the only way he could really do that was to prove that the cops who ran that raid, Scott Deppy and Neil Gerhardt, were corrupt.
Right.
And so he was looking for evidence of that, and there was a lot of evidence of that.
Right. A lot of evidence.
And so the story that Phil tells is that around Christmas of 1980, Earl's son was in his office downtown with Pigpen and some of the other members of the Outsiders, and he told Pigpen, he said, "Don't worry, you're going to go to jail." He says, "I've got the evidence, and I can prove that the police these police officers are guilty of 2 murders."
Right.
And shortly after the new year, he was found at his home, shot to death with his service revolver.
And this was a man who had bragged about he didn't like guns.
He never used it.
He had never used a service revolver. So I want to ask you, Don, this question, which most people don't know about. This is inside information that you shared with Phil Stanford, but he didn't use in the book because it's hearsay or whatever. But you know of certain things that Scott Deppy did to a former wife of yours and a former older son of yours. So do you want to talk about that?
Well, this Vice gang that was doing all of these robberies were also involved in several ongoing robberies of a former wife of mine who was not a heroin dealer, but a cocaine and marijuana dealer. And
this involved your older son.
this involved my older adopted son. And they would go over to their house and rob them. One time they robbed them of a 50-pound bale of marijuana, and they took it. Apparently they didn't care for the quality, and so they brought it back and traded it for something else.
And this was during about a
this was-
5-year period
Yeah.
when you didn't have any contact
I had
with
no
either
contact.
your ex-wife or your adoptive
No,
son.
we were divorced. So.
Right.
But this kept going on. My thing about it is that Earl's son knew all of this, and he was murdered in 1981,
Yeah.
and Zebedee Manning was murdered in 1975.
75. Both ruled
So-
suicide.
Right, both ruled suicide. And I've always thought that Earl's son had figured out which one of the guys had Zebedee Manning, and that was one of the 2 or 3 murders
I
that
think-
he knew about.
I think that's true.
So, and that's
we
why
can't actually discuss who we think did that, but we
But-
can say you can share
Yeah.
with the listening audience what you remember your ex-wife telling you about these two people
Well, they
coming to their home.
They would come to the house and
And didn't it get so?
Rob-
It became so frequent that at one point she made a Thanksgiving dinner.
yeah,
and
my ex-wife finally got to the point where she just invited them for Thanksgiving dinner, and
Right.
they got to be kind of family. You know, they'd come for their dope before they go to work and have dinner and have a drink and whatever, and go out to go to work.
And at one point during one of the initial robberies, isn't it true that Scott Deppie took a gun and held it to your adoptive son's head
Yes, absolutely.
and threatened to kill him?
Threatened to kill him. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the nature of the animal that was being protected by the upper people at that time, who Phil Stanford names in his book to a certain
The only
point.
reason that they're being protected is because this is part of a corrupt system that's been
Right.
going on for generations.
Right.
And if obviously we have two cops that are completely out of control.
Right.
But if we do anything about it, it's going to expose all this stuff that everybody else is involved in.
Exactly.
Trying to keep a lid on a just an impossible situation. Yes. So this is just something I was thinking about talking about. You know, I've mentioned it a couple of times to some people, and people have also mentioned to me. Phil Stanford has been accused of being a conspiracy theorist by more than a few people. And can you give me that? And one of the really beneficial things about Don's book, Behind the Badge in River City, a Portland police memoir, which was first published in 2015. This is the second edition, and it was published in 2016, is that with Don's book, Behind the Badge in River City, it really corroborates all of that Phil Stanford ever said in Portland Confidential. And now Phil Stanford has, I mean, obviously he's always had credibility, but there were a lot of people that would say he's a conspiracy theorist. It wasn't really that bad. These things didn't really happen. And with Don's book corroborates everything he ever said in Portland Confidential and now in Rose City Vice.
It's funny that you say that, because I've actually heard from the other side that maybe he's part of the conspiracy because he only tells a little bit of the truth. What Phil does is he tells you what he can prove.
Right.
He's an old-fashioned journalist. That
Right.
means he has journalistic ethics.
Exactly.
Which means he's only going to tell you what he believes to be the truth
Right.
because he's checked it.
Right, and that's important. He's an investigative journalist. Yes.
And so he only tells a little bit of the story, and there's a lot more. So that's the conspiracy that I've heard him accused of being involved in, is keeping the cover on. But he's taking the cover off, but a lot of this stuff is really difficult to prove, especially
Right.
after so much time.
Right.
And, and I personally think things haven't really changed in Portland. 30 or 40 years from now, the stories about what are happening now are going to come out, and we're going to know the truth about our city government. Because it takes that long for this stuff to come out.
I agree with that to a degree, but I also think that PPB is not as corrupt as it was in 1975 or 1980.
I don't know.
I really don't think it is, because
I don't have any reason to believe it's not.
okay, it's just like, I mean, when you consider this recent thing that happened with Marshman, and he was turned in by 3 people. I mean, I think there's such an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion.
There's a different feeling among police officers these days than there were in those days.
There is definitely not. I don't think there's as much of a sense of camaraderie as there was in the 70s or the 80s, because
that could be true. Don would know a lot more about that.
Yeah.
I mean, you wrote in your book about one of the guys who was a patrolman. He worked at East Precinct, and then you worked together as detectives. Phil Todd, a great cop. All I've ever heard about him were good things, and how he would come to the precinct drunk like 3-4 times a week, and the other guys would ply him full of coffee and drive him around to get him to sober up, because
Stuff him in a police car. and
stuff
take
him in a police
somewhere.
car
Before roll call.
before roll call.
That's in the
Because-
days of the Portland Police Athletic Association.
Yeah. Yeah.
because they were trying to help their friend out. That kind of thing probably wouldn't happen
I don't know. Probably not.
today on the same level, but anyway.
The fascinating thing to me about this book is that I'm one of the few people that knows just about everybody that
Yes.
they talk about in
Right.
there.
Yes.
All of these thugs and thieves from Battle Nelson, who I had an unfortunate encounter with, and was later murdered, as covered in this story.
Yeah, Battling Nelson, Willie Nelson.
You know, I worked for all these people. Was it Larry
Masney.
Masney, who is prominently talked about in the book as a heroin addict and a burglar. I can remember Larry Masney was such a problem to us when we were working burglary. We knew where he lived. We were going to try and catch him in red-handed because chasing after this broken doors and broken windows he was keeping didn't help.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about what happened to you with Willie Nelson? You were a patrolman, and it was probably about 1963 or 64, and you had an encounter with, what was his first name, his real name?
Harold.
Harold Penland,
Penland,
a.k.a. Willie Nelson.
Well, that was a long time ago. So I was working traffic. I was parked at 72nd and Woodstock, and I was writing a report. And this car Cadillac just flew by in front of me, right through the stop sign. Whoa. So I pulled out behind him. I had an unmarked car, turned on my red light. Duke Street was the next traffic stop sign, and that was the city limits. So once he got out to Duke, headed towards Flavel, he was out of the city. I was able to get him pulled over about a half a mile out into the city limits and get him stopped. Got him out of the car. He was drunk, very combative. I didn't know who he was. I told him he was under arrest. I tried to grab him and handcuff him. He jerked out of it. He was very strong.
Yeah.
Grabbing him like grabbing a pipe.
And he was a professional boxer.
It turned out he was a professional boxer, yeah. And all of a sudden I saw this flash of a blade as he come as he tried to stab me. And he took off running. I fired a shot at him or two. And the next day the detectives found him and arrested him, and there was a bullet hole in his coat.
The left side of his lapel, yeah.
Right side of his coat.
Right side? Okay.
Yeah, so he came about 4 inches from dying.
Wow.
And he died by gunshot wound
He
in a
did.
day,
He did, and it's
Several years later.
It's one of the long unsolved murders in Portland. The
Yeah.
murder of Harold and Laura Penland in I think 1980, 81.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's really interesting because Phil tells the story, and he names who are most likely to be the killers in here, which was Willie. There's a lot of suspects, but Willie's heroin supplier and his brother, who was a professional killer, are probably the ones that did it.
Right.
And the story that Phil has told me he doesn't tell in here is that I think I can't remember the name, but the heroin dealer was in Hawaii on vacation, and Willie burglarized his house while he was on vacation. That was Willie liked to steal from people,
Right.
And he had regular burglary scams for his whole career, and but he didn't know that there was a security camera on.
Right.
And so the heroin dealer came home and found his house burgled, and then he found the security video that showed it was Willie who had done it.
Right.
And that was the reason he was actually.
That makes sense.
So it's kind of nice to know who finally killed Willie, battling Willie Nelson.
What's interesting about this?
And his
this
poor
is
wife.
Rose City Vice, Portland in the 70s, Dirty Cops and Dirty Robbers by Phil Stanford. Another really interesting aspect of that story is what happened to Laura Penland. And this is information that Phil got from some of his underworld sources. She was told by the killers that she could shoot up heroin one last time and take as long as she needed or as much as she needed. And they had tried to prevent her from being there the day before by inviting her to dinner, but she had the flu. And that's kind of an interesting story.
It's a sad story.
It
It's
is.
just a heartbreaking story
It is.
because what it tells me is she knew the killers.
And they didn't want to kill her.
And they liked her.
Right, and they liked her.
And it makes sense because the house that Willie lived in was a fortress.
Right.
He was paranoid.
Right.
Rightfully so, because he'd been victimizing people for 20, 30 years.
He'd been burglarizing homes, and he'd also been raping. He'd been
yes.
raping regularly throughout the city.
Yeah.
So he had created a lot of enemies.
Yeah.
And he died shot to death. Do you know if he was shot in the head or the chest?
I don't know. He was hanging upside down
was
in a pair
hanging
of
upside
gravity
down.
boots. I know that.
That's just awful.
When was he killed?
I think it was 81,
Yeah, 81.
80, something like that. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
and they're both on the cold case. They're both
So it was
Penland
about
and-
1965 when I first run across him, so he lived another 20 years.
yeah. He was probably not much older than you. You both were probably in your early 20s.
He victimized a lot of people in that time, too.
Yeah.
1983. He died in 1983.
83,
Yeah.
It was 65 or so when I run across him, 65, 66.
And the story of his wife's death is very, very sad.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that is definitely really sad. It kind of shows in a bizarre way that sometimes killers and criminals can have a very interesting code of ethics. You know, because they could have just not let her shoot up. They could have. I mean, it was a kindness.
Yeah.
You know.
Sometimes we have kindness.
Even a professional killer might.
So I had written out these questions for Phil, but did you want to talk about Vince Capitan? Anything that you know that
Do you know about Vince Capitan? Did
Very
you?
low. No,
Yeah,
the Iceman?
He was in jail.
He was in jail most of the time.
Yeah.
I was a detective.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah, Vince Capitan was a Portland character. It's a great picture of him in here in his sharkskin suit.
Yeah, with the skinny tie.
He was a drapery hanger. The Oregonian called him an interior decorator. But he wanted to be a gangster.
Right.
And he wanted to be a tough guy. And he was a petty criminal from San Francisco who had gone to McNeil Island. And he had committed a federal crime by, I think, robbing a Wells Fargo courier in San Francisco. So he ended up in McNeil Island. And while he was there, he met another ex-boxer, Carl Mendoza, who was from Portland and who was kind of a semi-famous boxer from Portland. And I don't remember what he'd gone to jail for, but he was also at McNeil Island. He was the champion boxer at McNeil Island. And so they both got out around the same time and went into business together. They were smash and grab guys.
Right.
One would go into a business and talk to the owner or the person who was working there and kind of distract them, while the other one would go back and take everything out of the cash register. So really low-level criminals.
Right.
Tilt-tap. It's called a tilt-tap.
The
Tilt-tap. Tilt-tap.
Yeah, the tilt-tap.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
The smash and grab guys go in with the.
oh, right,
with the
you're right.
pickup.
Sorry, it was a tilt-tap. Okay, I got my jargon correct. But he married, I think Joni Wright is her name, was his wife's name. She was a madam, ran prostitution. And Michael Wright was her son, and so Vincent's stepson.
Right.
And he was bringing him into the family business. So Michael was learning to be a pimp.
Okay. Right. Prostitution.
And so Carlos Mendoza became a problem. It was because of an arrest. And I think it might have been an arrest in McMinnville in 1968. And he was rolling over on Capitan. He was going to cooperate with the police and give evidence on Capitan and send Capitan to jail. And he had also made the mistake of beating up one of Michael Wright's prostitutes.
Yeah.
Mendoza was a sadist who liked to beat prostitutes with a wire coat hanger.
And there's another connection to that. We'll talk about in a second if you want right now.
I think he killed Olivia Brown a few weeks before he died, but I have no evidence.
Well, and you said she was beaten with a coat hanger.
With coat hangers.
That's a signature bit. I mean,
I think he's the killer.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason that besides the fact that she was an expendable person, and they probably didn't waste any resources on her.
And Olivia Brown is mentioned in Rose City Vice.
No.
She's not.
No, she's not.
Okay.
That's my own bugaboo.
Okay.
That's my own unsolved case.
And I've read it page to page, and I there's a lot to absorb, so I'm gonna have to read it at least twice more.
But anyway, Vince Capitan wanted to, first of all, make sure that Carlos Mendoza didn't talk, and second, send a message to everybody that you can't cross him.
Right.
And so he shot him to death.
Yeah.
And Michael Wright ended up being part of the rap for that and ended up going to jail, or I don't remember what happened exactly to Michael, but Vincent Capitan did end up in jail for murder in 1968. And while he was in jail, he learned the crystal meth business.
Right.
And so when he got out in the 70s, he set up a crystal meth operation with a lab out at Boring, and had the Outsiders Motorcycle Club doing distribution for him. At the same time, he was driving the kiddie train up at Washington Park Zoo.
That is so comical. I read that and I was like, really? Seriously?
He had to have a job because he was on probation. So it's a wild story.
Right.
And it completely sets up the 1979 raid on the Outsiders Club because Scott Deppie and Neil Gerhardt from the Special Investigations Division of the Narcotics Squad were targeting Capitan because he no longer had protection. Before he went to jail, he was protected and they couldn't really go after him. After he got out of jail, he was kind of a man. He was running crystal meth operation. He had the Outsiders Motorcycle Club working with him, and they decided to get him. And it was this process that they raided his club out, or his lab out in Boring, but it was all cleaned up. So they didn't have any evidence, so they planted some heroin on Capitan. This was these guys, this was their standard operating procedure. If we don't find drugs, we've got them for you. So they planted heroin on him and violated his parole, and then they went after the outsiders. And that led to the shooting of Dave Crowther, which led to the murder trial of Pigpen Christian, which led to the investigation of Deppie and Gerhardt and their crimes.
And then also led to Earl Sun's
death. Yes.
However that happened.
And so it's this big tangled
Sure.
web that Phil does a great job of telling in a very slim, easily read book.
Yes.
And Vincent Capitan is one of the big characters. Lots of characters.
Yeah.
Phil's real talent is telling the stories of people. And he does a great job.
He has a wonderful Donic style of writing. It's very witty and very Mike Hammer-like, but it's fun. He's fun to read.
More intelligent than Mike Hammer.
Right, exactly. But what I find interesting about that the killing...
Mendoza?
Yeah. The prostitute that was beaten.
Olivia Brown.
Right, because it was a favorite method of
Mendoza was known for beating women with
beating
coat hanger.
Prostitutes and women's with, and I'm presuming it's a metal and a wood coat hanger, right?
I always assume metal. I don't know.
Probably the most damage a coat hanger could do would not be the plastic or the metal ones they have, but the metal and the wood ones.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that being beaten in the face with a metal and wood coat hanger would disfigure a prostitute.
I don't know that that's what he was doing. I think it was just about pain. He liked to inflict pain.
Wow. Yeah, because for them to use that as another reason to want to kill him, I mean, he must have really messed that girl up.
He did. He hurt her.
That's terrible. Yeah.
And he was a sadist. He liked to hurt women.
Yeah.
So as a murder victim, good choice, but don't kill people.
Right. Right. Exactly. I was really curious about what happened. This question was meant for Phil. I'm really curious about Ginger Cardwell, and she's in the book. And in the book, Phil suggests that she was
She's on the cover there.
Yeah, she was
Let me see.
She was like a pornographer, or
I don't even remember the story.
She sexy saunas, right?
Is that what? Yeah,
I think so.
So they were laundering the money from George Desbrezet's heroin operation through the sexy saunas.
Yeah.
And she was a beautiful woman. There's a photograph of her right there. She was blonde, and Phil Stanford suggests in the book that she disappeared and her boy may have murdered her. But he also says he heard that she married a rich Californian.
Yeah.
Personally,
Terry Meidel was her boyfriend,
Right.
and they were involved in that. I think it was the sexy saunas.
the sexy saunas, yeah.
One of those massage parlor deals they were involved with.
It makes you wonder. I mean, if you can't find anything on her, if there's no record of her, I'm presuming, number one, she probably was murdered and disappeared.
Well, and Terry Meidel's later history kind of lends credence to that.
And what was that?
I don't remember the details, but he ended up becoming a very hardcore outlaw after her disappearance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of confirms.
But
that kind
another
of thing
that Phil goes into, besides the massage parlors, the Portland massage parlors of the 70s, he gets into the pornography shops.
Right.
And I did not even realize that the film loop projector was invented here in Portland.
It was invented here in
by
Portland.
Tom Shaw, one of our crazy filmmakers.
Right.
And he patented that, and then they opened the first pornography loop shop on Southeast Burnside and 7th. I remember that shop.
Was it Cindy's?
No, Cindy's is on the other side of the river.
Right.
And that was Michael Wright's business later.
Oh, I know which one you mean.
But it was right on the corner of 7th and Burnside.
Right.
And my great uncle was the electrician who wired it. And I didn't put this together until many years later. But I remember my Uncle Cliff telling me about that.
His name was Tom Shaw.
Tom Shaw
and
was
he invented the loop.
He was the inventor of the loop projector. And his partner at one point ended up going to jail for drugs. And then later partnering with Michael Wright in Cindy's shop. But Tom Shaw kind of inherited all of these pornography shops. He was an engineer and an inventor and a would-be filmmaker. And suddenly he had a huge amount of money from these pornography shops, and so he started making films.
Right.
And he made, I forgot what it's called, The Courier of Death, I think.
The Courier of Death.
It's considered the worst film ever made by some people.
the French, some French,
Scottish.
Some Scottish filmmakers have deemed The Courier of Death the worst film ever made, even above Plan 9 from Outer Space, which I find amazing.
Tom Shaw is kind of our own Ed Wood. He's kind of the Portland version of Ed Wood.
Right.
Because in the 70s, he opened a little movie studio on Southeast Division to make his crazy films.
Right.
And they describe him as kind of a short guy who always drank White Russians. And by 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he was out. He would never could do 2 takes. Always had to be 1 take, no matter how bad it was. This is part of what gave his films their awfulness. But he also provided opportunities for a lot of the kids in the neighborhood, young teenagers that wanted to make movies, and one of them was Gus Van Sant.
Oh my gosh, that's
It's how Van Sant got his start, was working with Tom Shaw.
Interesting. I do remember that.
It's a great story. I'm going to have to write it up for my Weird Portland blog one of these days.
Yeah. So I was going to ask Phil about if he had any special information on Neil Goldschmidt, what he knows about Neil Goldschmidt.
He definitely has some information on Goldschmidt in here.
Is it all in here, or is some of it in here?
I think he tells pretty much what he knows.
Okay.
But
He tells what he knows.
do you want to...
Well, Neil Goldschmidt was before my time, so I don't know much about him other than just the rumors. So.
Yeah. Well, it was...
The one
After
who
your
knows
time.
about him is Ron Buell.
Was he the driver?
No, Ron Buell. Ron
no.
Buell was his...
Oh, the...
Ron Buell was his...
Campaign manager.
Okay.
Yeah. But we...
Okay.
But
But
we need to talk about that.
what it looks like is that the Vice Squad
We need to talk about that.
followed Neil Goldschmidt one night without knowing who it was, and they found out that he was having an affair with a 13-year-old girl in his neighborhood.
And the one cop called her his little honey.
Yes, there was a lot of that, and then they actually had evidence on him and possibly mailed him during union negotiations.
Right. Yeah.
It's like they basically the police union said, we know what the mayor's doing.
Right.
We know that the majority of the city council are using cocaine on a regular basis.
Right.
We don't care about anything but the contract that we're negotiating.
Right. I do remember that from reading the book.
We will look the other way
Exactly. Just give us a good deal.
if you give us a deal. Has the police department changed?
I don't know.
I don't know either. One of the interesting people in here is the guy that uses the nickname the Senator.
The senator.
The Senator. And his picture is in there, and what's an interesting thing to me
This is, we need to mention him because the audience might not know who you're talking about.
I'm not
This
sure.
is the snitch. What was his name? The arsonist?
Roland. Jack Roland.
Jack Rowland.
Jack Rowland.
I didn't know
Right.
he was the senator.
So Don
Yeah, well,
bumped into him a few years ago, and he goes by the senator. This is Jack Rowland.
yeah. He was kind of a compassionate guy. Kind of interesting thing about him is he was a professional arsonist, and I had occasion to visit him and get to know him a little bit while we were both in Multnomah County Jail. I was there on a humbug, and I got to know Roland a little bit, and he talked to me about some of the things that he was involved with, and he admitted to be and bragged about being a professional arsonist. And so
We should explain why you were there. You were falsely accused of firing a weapon in the city limits, and the case was thrown out of court by Judge Litzenberger for lack of evidence.
yeah, it was a humbug charge.
It was a humbug.
Some of the cops in the Portland Police Department were still trying to catch me.
Yeah. We looked at the discovery, and one of the
Anyway.
detectives had written, apparently DuPay was a detective, which I consider a hostile kind of note. But anyway, what were you saying?
Anyway, he was involved in a lot of arsons around town, and he told me that the best way that he found to burn down a house was to put a pound of bacon in an iron skillet, put it on the stove, turn it on high, and leave. He says it worked for him a couple of times.
Wow.
And he was an arsonist that was involved in a lot of planning, and so he would go into business, so to speak, with the business owner that wanted his business burned down, and they would arrange to have the correct amount of insurance that covered the employees for loss of income during the time that the business would be down, loss of business insurance, and so everybody was taken care of.
So he
And
was an arson consultant.
He's an arson consultant, and then after
had
all,
ethics.
after it was all taken care of, he'd wait a while, and then a fire would start. And he bragged about he burned down a large machine shop, and he also told me he burned down Sailor's old country kitchen.
He was also involved in burning cars, which is one of the stories in
Burning
here
cars, yeah.
for the insurance.
One of the most entertaining stories.
So it wasn't a hot steak.
Wasn't a hot steak.
It wasn't a hot
It
steak.
was
There's a pound of bacon in the frying
It wasn't a pound of bacon, no.
One of the most enjoyable stories from this book that I really enjoyed, and I definitely know why it's the last story, is the story about Buddy Moore. I met Buddy Moore once about
And he was a
3
used
years
car
ago.
dealer, right?
He was a used car dealer. I met him one time 3 years ago, and he seemed perfectly fine. We found out recently he's in a home for Alzheimer's. But the story about Buddy Moore in the end, during the 1975 shortage of antifreeze that resulted in this criminal conspiracy happening in Portland, and how did you describe it?
Damon Runyon. It's a
Right.
Runyon-esque story.
Right.
Damon Runyon was an old-fashioned newspaper man from
Mm-hmm.
New York City who wrote short stories about the criminals who inhabited Broadway in those days. Guys and Dolls, the famous musical, comes from
Mm-hmm. Right,
his stories.
right.
And I think that Phil does an excellent
Mm-hmm.
job of writing a Runyon-esque story about not quite bad guys. Because Buddy Moore comes out as kind of the hero of
Mm-hmm. He
this
does.
story. And it's called Dino's Christmas, and Dino loses all of his money, $5,000 in a antifreeze scam, and if he can't get it back, his kids are not going to have Christmas.
Right, and this is because of some crooks that came either from New York or Chicago. These are out-of-state crooks
Yeah.
that came to Portland, thought that we were going to be easy, and then it backfired.
And Buddy tracks him down and gets Dino his money back and finds love at the same time. It's a beautiful story, and I hope it becomes the classic Portland Christmas story.
Well, it's a wonderful story, and I remember reading it and just thinking, it's only about 3 pages long, but there's so many details and dates and facts packed into it that it could easily become a screenplay. It could become a film. It really could. I mean,
It's a beautiful story.
It's a wonderful story. So yeah.
I also knew Buddy Moore. I bought a Cadillac from him when he had a car lot on about 84th or 86th.
You've got a buddy in the car business.
I had a buddy in the car business.
And what was his logo?
I have a buddy in the car business.
Right.
So
Call Buddy
bought,
Moore.
bought
You've got
a
a
car
buddy.
from him and got to know him that way. And then when we moved our dispensary over to 112th and Sandy, he took the space adjacent to us, and he had another car lot there.
And that's where I met him
And
about
where
3
we
years
met,
ago.
yeah. And my son bought a Lincoln from him, and made 2 payments with cocaine. So
Well, Buddy was flexible that way.
he was flexible. He was flexible. Yes.
Well, you found that out later, honey. You weren't aware of that, remember? We discussed that.
It's a true story.
I know.
It's a true story. Everything you hear here is true.
Well, generally. Generally, and for the most part. So you've got some of your books here, JD.
I do, yeah, and
Including the book that we co-authored.
yes, and part of my work in writing these books was to corroborate some of the stuff in Portland Confidential.
Yeah.
Portland on the Take
Right.
goes from the 1934 dock strike up to 1950 and the Joanne Dewey murder, and it kind of sets the scene for the vice scandal that came a few years later.
Yeah.
Because it talks about how that built and where what was taken over and who did the taking over and how it all arranged. And then the book that we wrote goes back a couple of decades past that and sets up
Murder
Portland
and
on the
Scandal
Take.
and Prohibition Portland.
And it shows some of the and this is not the original corruption, because I could probably write 2 more volumes going back another 100 years,
Sure.
showing very similar stories. But this shows how Prohibition allowed the corruption to really get organized.
Yeah. And when we were doing the research for that, you did the majority of the research, but I did a little bit in the Portland Archives and Records Center, and I found 2 letters. That was a really exciting
That
moment.
was a very exciting moment.
I found 2 letters from Frank Irvin to the Chief of Police Leon Jenkins, and they had been sanitized from both Jenkins' file and from Frank Irvin's file. But they forgot that the secretarial pool would include copies to who it was about, who it was from, and who it was going to. And so there were these 2 copies that were in John Cortez's file.
Thank God
and
for
I found
bureaucracy.
those. Yes.
Because they're the smoking gun. They show that Chief Jenkins knew about the violations of prohibition that were going on.
And
I
remember there were 2. I think they were both written in April 17th. And I think it was 1930, 29 or 30.
I don't remember.
But they were basically, Frank Irvin was accusing Anna Schrader of certain things, and basically he corroborated that there was indeed bootlegging going on out of the police headquarters, in downtown Portland. And I remember when I was reading them, I got that feeling. I got really excited, and I thought, these are important. I just know JD's going to want to see these.
Yeah.
That was exciting. That was
exciting.
exciting. And it happened from me just being really tenacious and just going through the files of anyone mentioned in the newspaper articles from the Oregonian.
And following that Anna Schrader thread, I knew that was a valuable thread, because she is such an interesting character such an important character, and nobody remembers her.
I know.
And I think it's really good that we've dug out what we have about her,
Yes.
and that people are starting to remember a little bit about Anna Schrader.
And I think it's important to keep her memory alive and to continue to do research on her, because I just know there's more out there.
And
about
she's
her.
surprising. She's a beauty queen. She's a famous swimmer. She's a private detective who worked for the police bureau.
Yeah.
She was trained
Yeah.
as a police officer.
Yeah.
She wasn't a very good shot, which is probably a good thing, because she didn't hit
William Bruning
when she fired her shots at him.
Yeah.
And then she really turned on the police bureau when she felt like she'd been left behind.
Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Yes. And she really let people know what was going on, and then she was so demonized and turned into a crazy person by the whole process.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very sad story. And then I think, I truly believe that she's the victim of the 1946 torso murder.
I do
who
too.
was never identified.
I do too. I remember, I've looked at the photographs of the skull, the description of the skull, the hair. There's so many similarities. And I actually did contact the medical examiner, Karen Gunson, and some other people that she works with that do forensic photography and forensic computer facial reconstruction. And unfortunately, I really pushed it. Unfortunately, none of the photographs that we currently have would be anything they could use to do that. Right. And I emailed back and forth and begged and pleaded, and the woman that I was communicating with told me there's just not enough. But I know what I was able to discern with naked eye, and I think that there's some validity to that.
There's definitely a similarity.
When you look at the skull and the eyebrows and the eyes and the cheekbones and the hairstyle, ringlets, when you look at the photograph of Anna Schrader with her hair done, the ringlets from the Oregonian article, and when you look at the skull and when you look at the notes from the autopsy, there's just too many parallels in terms of identification. So I also definitely believe that the torso remains are Anna Schrader.
Yeah.
Were Anna Schrader. But you also have a book here. It's another one of your books, Murder and Mayhem in Portland, Oregon.
Murder and Mayhem in Portland, Oregon is my history of the city in murders. Mm-hmm. It goes from 1850 up to about 1945.
Yeah.
And I picked out murders from different periods of that time to illustrate different points about the city.
Right.
So I tell a lot of murder stories. I talk about the Dark Strangler in the 1920s, and the Hill family in 1911, one of our big unsolved murders of the century, really. It was a whole family that was killed with an axe down in a suburb. And never
in Portland?
Never solved. Yeah, it was just outside of Portland, down near Selwood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it wasn't actually part of Portland at the time.
I do remember reading through that briefly. I need to look at that again.
And I identified a suspect in that, too. One of the biggest unsolved cases. It's pretty clear that this guy might have been involved.
That's the interesting thing about old murder cases. You read about some of these old murder cases, and these guys, many of these police officers in the late 1800s, the early 1920s, the teens, had less than an 8th grade education. Mm-hmm. And you really see the difference between police officers and investigators from that period, and then those who came on in the 30s, 40s, 50s, especially the 60s and the 70s, it became more of a science then. And back then, these guys were struggling with basic literacy.
Yeah.
And you read about some of these cases, and you're like, gosh, it seems so clear.
That particular murder was not a Portland case. That was County Sheriff, and it was Sheriff Mass, who ended up becoming the longest-serving Clackamas County Sheriff.
Yeah.
But this was his very first term. He had just been elected to office, and he had no police experience.
Yeah.
And he was not able to catch this killer. Although there's some amazing things. This is some of the first use of forensics in a murder investigation was on this Hill family case.
Really?
And it was two doctors from Portland who invented a spray-on chemical that could pick up traces of blood.
Oh,
it was
wow.
it was the first
That's
use of
fascinating.
that, and it's in 1911. They
Wow.
also there was a psychic involved.
Oh my gosh.
It's a crazy story, and it's a very interesting one. I tell the story of Bunko Kelly's murder. Bunko Kelly, the famous crimp. Everyone talks about the Shanghaiing. He actually went to jail in 1894 for a murder that he committed. He always said he was framed, and he really kind of was framed, but he also probably really committed that murder. So.
And then you also have this book, which you've said is your most popular book. It's called History of Portland, Oregon, and this is a little thicker than those two books, but this is your most popular bestseller.
It is, and this is maybe the book I'm most proud of. Hidden History of Portland.
Is this the first one?
No, it's the second one.
The second one, okay.
This one is not a murder-related book. What I wanted to do was tell the untold history of Portland. So I talk about the Native American history and the women's history and the gay history and the African American history and Asian American history. And I just go into some real detail, and it's some things that we've forgotten. It's not anything that's unknown. It's just stuff that we have forgotten over the years. And they're using it out at Madison High School to teach a local history class. I hope other high schools will pick it up too.
Yeah.
In fact, tomorrow, if it's not raining too much, I'm taking the Madison High School kids on a field trip out to Lone Fir Cemetery.
Oh, that's right. You do this on a regular basis. That's wonderful.
It'll be our second annual one. And last year, they put a stone on the unmarked grave of Portland's first black firefighter.
That's right, and that made them
very, very proud of those kids.
And that was something that you started.
I helped. I showed them. I showed them what needed to be done.
And then they created a program where they did some fundraising, and they put this.
They got in touch with the police, with the fire department, which was actually they're replacing. One of the big problems that we have out at Lone Fir Cemetery is over the years the stones get worn and they sink down into the ground.
Right.
And so a lot of the graves that are unmarked weren't originally unmarked. And and also we have 12 of the people whose names are on the Dave Campbell Memorial, firefighters who died in the line of duty. 12 of them are buried there in the firefighters' cemetery at Lone Fir, and most of those gravestones were not even readable anymore.
Wow.
So they were putting 12 gravestones out there, and these kids got in touch with the committee that was doing that and told about this black firefighter who had no marker, and so they put 13 stones instead of 12.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And this is, I just want to promote Don's book a little bit too. This is Behind the Badge in River City of Portland Moore. We've spent the last year working with Barnes & Noble, so they're probably going to be selling it within the next month or two. But the second edition of Don's book has an additional story. It's called Clarence's Sidewalk Demise, and it's a very cinematic story. It's on page 187. This was the story that Don didn't want to write in the original book. It took me about a year to convince him to sit down and write it, and I edited it. It's a wonderful story. It's very graphic. It's very tragic. It's very sad, but it really shows how crime just doesn't pay, and it shows how difficult it was for people in North and Northeast Portland to survive without becoming in some way criminal, just because there were very few social opportunities.
One of the things I like the best about your book, Don, is how honest you are about stuff that's really hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's true, because when Don was writing this and when we were editing it, we had a really wonderful editor who was, I think at the time, he was just a little too young to be able to contribute in the way that I had hoped. He contributed a lot. He was really wonderful. He was able to shorten all of the chapters and knew when to do that. So he contributed a great deal. But one thing he kept saying was that we should take out certain sections where Don talks about mistakes he had made. He got angry once when he was chasing an eluder for about 25 minutes. The guy crashed. He ran over to the car. He pulled him out, and he kicked him twice in the chest. And this young man wanted to take that out. He wanted to take out about 3 or 4 sections where Don admitted to losing his temper, losing control. And I said, no, that's not what memoir is about. Memoir is about the good and the bad.
Well, I think it's really important to realize that you weren't doing anything that was unusual for Portland cops.
Right. And compared to a lot of police officers at the time, he was considered a do-gooder. And there was a situation where he was in St. John's, and there was a woman who had been murdered by her husband with a shot, and he called it in, and no one came to provide backup. And that's when he really knew he was alone, because he was considered a do-gooder. He was considered one of the new breed. But yeah, it's important when you're writing memoir. I feel this very strongly. You have to be honest. You can't just try to make yourself look good. You can't try to make yourself out to be a hero. Of course, Don comes across like a hero in many respects in his book, but he's honest about the ways that he lost control, the things that happen in a long career that really test a police officer's patience and their sense of hope. And he's honest about that, and that's what makes the book believable, and that's what makes him come across sympathetically, is because he's not trying to sugarcoat himself or make himself out to be a hero. He's honest about the things that he did that were difficult, and the ways that he made mistakes. But yeah, it's a wonderful book, and it is available on Amazon, and it will be selling in Barnes and Noble. So
I don't remember making any mistakes.
Losing control.
The thing about
kicking the guy in the chest.
The thing about being honest is you have to be honest because it's an emotional job.
Right.
And sometimes you react emotionally.
Yeah.
That's just the way the job is. So.
Well, we're concluding this episode of Oregon Voters Digest, and hopefully Phil Stanford is okay. I hope to hear from him soon, and we're going to try to get him on in the next week or two, because we wanted to ask him a lot of these questions. But thank you so much, JD, for coming here. And
I'm glad to pinch hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see you next time on Oregon Voters Digest. Thank you so much.